My name is Edward Michaud. I'm president of Trident Research and Recovery Incorporated, a marine salvage company that is presently involved in the salvage of a German U-boat off Cape Cod, Massachusetts.
Could you tell us how you first heard about this U-boat?
Well, the initial investigation into it occurred upon interviewing a tug skipper in Boston, Massachusetts. That was the first hint we had of its existence, and that was approximately 8 years ago.
And what, was this someone that you just met?
At the time it was. Yes, it was. Mr. Warren Leggett. He was a tug skipper, as I said, and was fairly knowledgeable about at least the existence of this vessel. Was not familiar with any of the circumstances surrounding its sinking, but was familiar with the existence, and after priming him quite often, it led to other sources of information.
What is it that's so interesting or unique about this particular wreck?
I would have to say that the most fascinating aspect of this vessel was the fact that it's not supposed to exist. All contemporary accounts and official histories state that the vessel was never even built, yet we obviously have it in our backyard.
If it wasn't supposed to exist, how did you find out anything more about it?
The process of discovery began by actually discovering that the vessel was not of the type we expected it to be. It was much larger than any known German U-boat type known to exist during the war.
What ideas have you managed to pull together about what it was doing there?
Well, it's a combination of facts and theories. Essentially, the bottom line is what we've come up with is that the vessel was here to negotiate an armistice on behalf of German industrialists. That's it in a nutshell, with complicity of U.S. State Department personnel as well as some intelligence personnel.
So can you take us through the chronology of events around about the time, from when the U-boat maybe set off from Germany?
Our records indicate the vessel departed Germany on or about July 20th of 1944. The record is pretty indicative of the 20th of July, the same day as the attempted assassination coup against Adolf Hitler, as it turns out. This makes sense, of course, because the people involved, as we found out, with this vessel were most probably also involved in the Nazi opposition in Germany in 1944.
So would it be fair to say that these were the good guys in Germany?
It's hard to say whether they're good or bad guys. These were the same people who put Hitler in power in the first place. So it's a matter of opinion, I suppose. I suppose as a description, a general description, you could say they were the German good guys if you consider there were such people. But yes, you could say they were the German good guys.
Well, I don't think necessarily they were.
No.
But so what are your ideas around that assassination attempt? What was going on in Germany at the time?
Well, as many people know, there were many assassination attempts on Hitler. The most effective, of course, was the last recorded attempt on the 20th of July, when a bomb was placed inside his briefing room at the Wolfschanze complex in Poland. And that turned out to be a failure, of course. But essentially, the people involved in this vessel and some of the industrialists and military personnel, which obviously assisted it to some degree, had also arranged previous attempts on Hitler's life. It was typically a gangster state in Germany. One must consider this. So it doesn't necessarily mean that they were trying to do good for the nation, but rather do good for themselves. Hitler was in the process of destroying his country and its industry.
So what was their motive?
Their motive was personal survival, corporate and personal survival. That's the bottom line.
So once this U-boat set off over here, what was the pattern of events across the Atlantic and when it arrived?
Again, in a nutshell, proceeding across the Atlantic from the 20th of July, we have strong indication that she proceeded out of the Baltic Sea from Dynia, Poland, departing from Dynia, proceeded past to the north of the British Isles, and then south between Iceland and the Irish coast, and then down into the North Atlantic, and thence to the Central Atlantic towards the U.S. eastern seaboard.
Okay, and what happened when it arrived?
Very interesting. When she arrived, obviously she was spotted way before she arrived on the coast. She was spotted several times by U.S. Spotter planes and British spotter planes. In fact, both U.S. and British Ultra were communicating with each other, asking each other if they knew anything about this vessel.
Who's Ultra?
Ultra was the top secret code and cipher school in Great Britain, and in the United States it was Naval Intelligence specifically. U.S. Army also had their version of Ultra. Ultra was code decrypt, essentially. And at the time it was the most classified secret of the war.
Okay, so when it arrived?
When did it arrive?
No, well, what happened when it arrived? What was the dates and what happened?
Well, she arrived approximately on the 24th of August, 1944, from what we can tell by the records. She was proceeding close to the coast. Obviously, the record indicates she was trying to find a good area for sending a transmission, and possibly for a rendezvous point as well. Some of the records indicate that there was a point jig in the records referred to by Allied intelligence, as well as some ultra decrypts. We're not too sure what that might mean, but it might refer to the point of rendezvous that this vessel was proceeding to. And this just happens to be 14 miles southeast of Chatham, Cape Cod, Massachusetts, in very shallow water, needless to say. And when she arrived on the 25th of August, she surfaced approximately just before sunset. And she was in the process of sending out a transmission, as we found out later from a Naval Intelligence veteran, a highly classified top secret Enigma transmission in diplomatic code, what they call a B-bar, high priority. And she was in an S5 location, O&I parlance for meaning very close to the station. The station that intercepted her transmission was a U.S. Naval Radio Intercept Station in Chatham, Massachusetts. And so it didn't take them long to get a fix on the vessel. As it turns out, there were no vessels or airships or planes deployed to intercept her that we know of. Certainly there are no records indicating that nobody is deployed directly to her to intercept her, which we thought very strange. But we did find out that the naval airship K-25 did proceed to the area. And there are very strong indications, according to the official records, the existing records, that she was attacked and indeed sunk by a naval airship shortly after submitting a transmission.
So what I find difficult to understand is if there were communications going on with the top level in Washington between this U-boat and them, how come the boat was sunk? Do you think it was under orders from Washington?
Good question, and a good point to raise. No, it's obvious by all accounts the vessel was not purposely sunk by any U.S. naval command, or any U.S. command for that matter. She was sunk obviously by accident. The bottom line again is that she was sunk by a naval airship that was simply out doing its job and had no idea what the vessel was up to, but only knew that it was an enemy vessel in Allied territory that needed to be attacked. And
so what evidence do you have for that, though?
What we do have are the Eastern Sea Frontier reports detailing the airship's traverse to that area and her activity in that area. We also have a Naval Intelligence decrypt of the last transmission sent by the U-boat in plain transmission, plain text, no coding, obviously sent in the last hasty seconds of the vessel's existence, saying, quote, "am being attacked by aircraft," unquote. And that was on 25 August in a place known as a local transmission.
But what was going on or what evidence do you have that the blimp, the naval blimp that was attacking the boat, was not following orders from Washington or from a higher level?
Well, there is a lack of documentation giving commands to the airship specifying an attack. There are commands to her asking her to proceed to the area of the vessel's location and search, but there are no records indicating an attack. But there are some very curious movements at the time the airship arrives on the scene, and shortly thereafter when a Red Able patrol is conducted by two surface craft, two Coast Guard boats and a sub-chaser. And they make some very strange maneuvers in the area as if they're looking for flotsam and jetsam from a sunk vessel. which is the obvious indication. And their logs tend to agree with this as well.
Right, now, how about the pilot of the, or the person that did the sinking?
Well, the person that claims a sinking, he seems to be off on a few details, but he's amazingly accurate on many others. And many people discount his statements, whereas we look at what he says and compare it with the official record and what we have found on site. And amazingly, what he says seems to match up with what we find.
So what's he been saying?
For example, his account was that he dropped 2 depth charges over the submarine as it was trying to submerge to lower its silhouette as a target. And while it was happening, he dropped 2 depth charges. One detonated, the other one was a dud. The one that detonated is number 350 Torpex depth charge. Detonated when it reached approximately 10 feet, directly over the what we now know as the U-boat's galley. And when he said he saw the detonation of the charge, when it went off, he said it was right behind the conning tower. And sure enough, the hole we found in the wreck, the detonation hole, the damage hole, was right behind the conning tower. And what he said he saw floating to the surface was what he believed to be heads of lettuce. Well, this made sense, because we know the damaged area was the galley. We know that from site surveys. So it seemed to match up pretty closely. And what he had to relate, the airship pilot had to relate when he returned, showed an immediate naval cover-up. Certainly the indications we've been getting, because he was immediately transferred the next day to Recife, Brazil.
Sorry, to where?
To Recife, Brazil, Naval Air Station. So he was removed from the scene as quickly as possible, along with the rest of the crew who were transferred to other bases throughout the country.
Is there any other evidence that him sinking this boat wasn't viewed too happily by some of his seniors?
Very much so. He was asked repeatedly by his Naval Intelligence interrogator whether he actually wanted to file a report mentioning the attack. And his words, quote unquote, was, "Yes, damn it, I sank a sub and I want credit for it." And the Naval Intelligence personnel reply was that, okay. And he marched him into the next room. This is upon his return, of course, a few hours later. And when he got into the next room, he asked him again all the questions that are in the war report. And he says, okay, you're dismissed. And the next, Joe thought it was all over, you know, the pilot that sank this. And the next thing he knew, he was transferred the next day. That's all he knew about it. We found it very strange, because the pilot had mentioned that the film showing the attack, the stern gun camera on the blimp obviously caught the detonation of the charge on the sub, but it disappeared. And according to the pilot, he had heard it was flown to Washington, D.C. the next day and just disappeared in the files. It cannot be found even today.
So, right, who is this? Who is this person? What's the guy?
We'll just say Joe for now, right. But we don't want to use his last name right now.
Okay, but you've managed to track him down?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Off the record, I'll tell you all about it.
Okay.
But right. Certainly on the record, I just want to keep his last name out for now.
Right, okay. So, have you any idea who was actually on this boat?
Actually, we don't. We can only surmise. We do know that there are a lot of paper trails leading up to the deployment of this vessel, and there are extremely strong indications that there could very well have been representatives of German industry, and that is the best scenario, everything that fits at this point. Certainly whoever was on board, we firmly believe represented German industry as a whole.
And do you think that they expected for the Americans to show them? I mean, remembering, of course, that 1944 is at the height of war.
Yes.
They were heading off to the United States. What makes you think or what would have made them think maybe that they would get a good reception?
Well, it's a long and complex story behind that. But essentially the whole story behind a German attempted armistice, as well as a safe haven, if you will, commenced in November of 1943. We know this from the existing record, in which Martin Bormann specifically commenced what they call Achten Fürland, which means action land of fire, referring to the southern geographical area of Argentina. Specifically, that operation dealt with German U-boats proceeding to South America. One, to hide potential Nazi war criminals, and two, to hide securities accumulated by the Nazi Reich throughout the years. Now, as we go into 1944, there are numerous attempts by these same people, as well as by additional anti-Nazi hardliners who wish to end the war for their own benefits and for what they think is best for their country, but mostly for themselves and corporate interests, corporate securities for post-war interests. And what happened was there were many contacts between, such as the Dulles brothers, U.S. intelligence in Switzerland, and German emissaries, and this is well documented. There are also many contacts with Franz von Papen, the German ambassador in Turkey, between himself and U.S. intelligence personnel both in Switzerland and in Lisbon, Portugal.
So is it possible that the Americans were expecting this boat, or do you think, I mean, is that possible or not?
I would say most definitely somebody in the United States expected the arrival of this vessel. There is no doubt about that. And every indication is that it could very well have been the State Department. For one thing, we do know that the transmission she was sending was earmarked for the White House map room. We know that from an interview from a naval intelligence veteran, Preston Howley, who was stationed in Chatham and intercepted the transmission. And it was bound to the White House map room, which we know is controlled by the State Department, or was at that time.
What sort of place would the White House map room have been? What kind of operations go on there?
White House map room was not a map room, really. It was a combined intelligence service. Army, Navy, Army Air Force, FBI, OSS, what have you, Naval Intelligence. And it was staffed by many uniforms at that time, but it was all run by the State Department. And it was equipped very heavily with decoding equipment. And it just happened to be equipped with a Geheimschreiber, a German coding machine, diplomatic coding machine, that we know was supplied to them by the German resistance in November of 1943. So we found that very interesting. And it was the only Geheimschreiber that was in the United States at that time.
So this would have been used to decrypt the message from the U-boat, possibly?
It was the only other coding machine that could understand the coding from this U-boat.
Okay, getting back to the last few years and your discovery of this. What sort of stage is the wreck at now? What sort of stage is the salvage operation at?
Right now we proceeded very cautiously through strict archaeological guidelines. We know that it is, for all intents and purposes, a war grave. So we have to proceed very cautiously. We also have to proceed very cautiously in our contents. Now, we don't know exactly what is inside the vessel. We do know there's some airtight sections in this vessel. But we do know that paperwork holds up well inside the hulls of submarines. And since there are airtight sections, there could very well be some very interesting revelations in the form of documentation. And if these people in this U-boat are bound here for an armistice, combined with possibly providing safe haven for securities, there's going to be indications of it inside the boat. No doubt about that.
And what state is the wreck in itself?
I would have to say overall it's in excellent condition, considering it is very heavily buried in sand. The conning tower was very heavily armored, so it held up rather well. It's got an awful lot of fishing net in it, and the site conditions are horrendous. The currents average between 2 and 4 knots at any time during diving operations. So essentially it's like a flag on a flagpole for the diver. It's very difficult. And visibility averages anywhere from 6 inches to 2 feet, which is very limited. It's much less than a meter.
Has there been interest from, for example, from the Navy or the government about your discovery? I would have thought that the Navy would be particularly interested.
Yes, well, you're correct. The Navy had much more interest than even we expected. We do know that the initial stages of our federal action, we filed federally for the rights on this vessel. And as soon as we did that, there was heavy opposition voiced by the Department of State through the Department of Justice. These are typical government organs at work. We knew we were onto something sensitive when we started receiving this information. What surprised us most was just in 1997, September of 97, We have a restraining order on the site, a federally issued restraining order, which even the military has to honor. What happened was, in the end of September, September 30th specifically of 1997, the U.S. Navy attempted to violate that restraining order, proceed to the site on their own with subcontracted vessels, civilian boats contracted by the Navy, and put divers down the boat, obviously in an attempt to remove sensitive items.
Now, I would have thought that was a relatively easy thing to do while you're on the shore, for them to dive on.
Well, we noticed them within hours. Certainly we caught them before they were able to deploy their divers. One, they had to locate it exactly. They had to locate the vessel exactly, which we had not given them the exact latitude, longitude of the wreck, so it took them time to do that. And also, a lot of the civilian crew on the contracted vessels were bragging about going to the U-boat site on Nantucket. So our people, some of which are on Nantucket Island, had heard about this. And so it didn't take us long to mobilize and get into action. And we called everyone from the State Department to the U.S. Navy and voiced our complaints politely but firmly, and also called the federal court, who were ready to take action at a moment's notice against any government agency violating this order. So we did stop the attempt, but it was a close call.
So how did you actually get through to the boats on the surface that that their presence wasn't really wanted there?
Well, I'm sure what happened, probably the biggest influence in that was the media. The next day after this started, we had a press coverage, a small press article, which I've given you a copy of. And it didn't take the Navy long to catch on to that and realize the media was onto them. And these people don't operate well outside shadows. Once you shed a light on them, they disappear. And that's exactly what happened. We didn't have to initiate the federal action, thank God. We didn't have to get the federal marshal up into it, because they got the message loud and clear. Not to mention me calling every admiral in the Pentagon I could think of, and talking to the actual site commanders in Chatham, the land-based commander, and convincing him that it was a federally filed site and that it would not be in his best interest to proceed. So it worked out well, as it turned out, but for a while we were scared.
What about the Coast Guard?
The Coast Guard were very helpful. They don't get involved as a policy with Navy operations, but they helped us in any way they could, and they did some favors for us.
Just give us an idea of the kind of what you might find when you finally do get down into the wreck and open it up. What kind of things are you what sort of things are you expecting?
Oh, I hate to speculate. Documentation, I know. I know we will find documentation. What kind of documentation is anybody's guess. My personal best guess would be documentation reflecting an armistice deal, perhaps. Also, there could be a reference to securities, securities transfers, security placements, what have you. For all I know, there could be Swiss bank account numbers. I just don't know. And it could be actual securities. There's no way of knowing this. But we do know that there will be records referring to the negotiations then ongoing between the Nazi industrialists, anti-Nazis if you will, and U.S. intelligence. But
this is a U-boat. It's not designed to carry silver or gold or whatever the Nazis might have been trying to get to Argentina.
Well, this is a warship, but it was a warship that could carry 600 deadweight tons of cargo without affecting her trim. So she was more than capable of performing a dual role.
There's not many warships that were, or not many, certainly submarines, that would be able to carry cargo, surely?
No. No, this was a special boat. She's 115 meters in length. She's, in feet, she's 32 feet wide. So, and she's 40 feet from the conning tower to keel. That's a very big submarine. In fact, it's larger than our present-day Los Angeles class attack submarines. Yes, so she is very capable. She's armed with twin armored turrets, each carrying a twin-barrel 127 millimeter gun. So she had a lot of firepower as well as a lot of cargo capacity. To increase her cargo capacity, they could have removed a lot of her shells and powder from her armories. So, and each one of those armories can carry at least 200 tons individually. So.
Okay, can you take us through the events? Okay, so it's been the blimp has depth charged the boat. What does it look like happened? So that and the boat then dived and set the depth charge off. Can you just take us through that kind of process?
Yes. What we've got so far in preliminary assessments on looking at the wreck site and looking at the surrounding shoal, it's obvious she was commencing a dive at the time she received an attack and the one depth charge going off. At that point, equilibrium was thrown off, and she commenced flooding. She's still proceeding on a headway. In other words, she's still going forward. At the time she's doing this, she's kicking over to one side or the other, port or starboard. Now, the mounts that are on her main deck level are gravity mounted. They're so heavy. They're gravity mounted. They probably weigh at least 12 tons apiece. And what happened, obviously, was one of those turrets actually fell off when she took an extreme list, probably to starboard. That would be our best guess. And as a result, that armored mount settled upside down in the sand some ways away from the final resting place of the wreck, say approximately 100 meters. We've located that armored mount, and it's full of sand upside down at the bottom, and it's quite a sight. And she proceeded, say another 100 meters, eventually coming to rest against a sand shoal in very shallow water, approximately 60 feet. But she sanded up very quickly. And that is why she was very hard to detect even today, because she constantly covers and uncovers with sand by as much as 10 or 20 feet sometimes. So even though she's a big boat, it's a big ocean and it's a lot of sand. So, but in most cases she's almost always exposed from the main deck up.
Okay. Going back to the possible securities on board, is it most likely to have been gold, do you think? If there was?
I hate to.
We still don't know.
Well, I really hate to speculate on anything to do with securities. Anything is possible.
Yeah. So you're saying that it's possible that the boat was making a stop off at Cape Cod and then was heading down to Argentina with the securities, possibly?
That is the indication given.
Were there other similar U-boat missions earlier during the war then?
Most definitely. We've confirmed at least 3 U-boat missions to South America, carrying securities under what the Allies call safe haven and what the Germans call Acton Furland. We don't know which U-boats, but we do know they arrived, and we have Argentine intelligence documents confirming that they were spotted unloading actual securities. And there are records existing of the securities deposit in the Banco Alaman Transatlantico and the Banco Tornquist in downtown Buenos Aires, facilitated by the Sullivan Cromwell offices, which is a law firm that just happens to be Alan Dulles' law firm. So
what happened to this money? Any idea?
Oh, it disappeared. Even today's recent inquiries on the Holocaust Assets Inquiry conducted by the State Department failed to address entirely the Argentine involvement of these securities. We find that very interesting. We have very strong indication. In fact, there is actually proof that a lot of these securities actually were transferred later to New York City at the Federal Reserve in New York. And when that happened, that was in 1950. They were subsequently resmelted in the U.S. assay bars from Nazi gold bars. The U.S. Federal Reserve did this now. That's documented. And they were sent on to Germany in 1950. There's your great German rebuilding program right there. Nazi money used to rebuild Germany with U.S. complicity.
So you think that there was some kind of relationship then between people like the Dulles brothers and some German industrialists?
Most definitely. There is no doubt about that. All of the history about the Dulles brothers, both Alan and John Foster, and their relationships with all the German industrialists that we've researched are very positive, very firm. They represented them in numerous lawsuits before and after the war. No doubt about it. Even the head of the Bank for International Settlements, Thomas McKittrick, was Alan Dulles' personal client in 1946. And BIS, as everyone knows, was very guilty of laundering Nazi money before, during, and after the war.
McKittrick landed in the top position
Sorry,
of
I
Chase
have
National
to
Bank.
ask you to be quiet. I'm sorry. Okay, so what's the situation now? Are you going to be, or what's the next step for you with this boat, with the U-boat? What's going to be happening next?
The next step is going to be interesting. As I said, we're proceeding cautiously. But once we penetrate this vessel, it'll go very quickly. We have to do it properly. We have an archaeologist for that, too. We fully plan to address all of the concerns of all governments and historians. Our objective is to preserve everything recovered, no matter what it may be, and use it for public dissemination. They're going to know that the world is going to know what's in this boat. It's as simple as that. And we're going to do our best to make it happen.
Okay, that'll do fine. Thanks very much, Ed.
And make sure my headphone set's turned all the way. Yeah. Okay, speak in a normal tone of voice and we'll see how it sounds.
Okay, Ed, how's this sound?
That's pretty good. That's pretty good. Okay, and if I stay away from the microphone, I won't overpower your voice.
Okay.
We actually have two, the one on your shirt and this one will pick up some too.
I see.
All right, I'll get a chair here and we'll get the
Yep.
script. Cutting my cord. Got the directions on the back of the question there.
Yeah.
The directions were perfect. I
Yeah.
had trouble finding it wrong. Alrighty. Now, when you're ready to start, just push the red button. When the red light goes out, the tape is rolling.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll start with just a little background, identify yourself.
Okay, can do.
Tell us whatever you can about how you happen to be there or
Yeah.
whatever you feel comfortable.
All right, good. All set?
Yeah.
All right, let me get this.
Asking you to identify yourself and tell us a little bit about how you came into this scene.
Okay, my name is Preston Howley, and I'm a former U.S. Navy veteran, World War II. I entered the Navy on May 26, 1943, and finished my naval service on April the 24th, 1948.
Now, you were 18 years old.
I was 18 years old when they went in the Navy, and I was assigned to Newport, Rhode Island boot camp, where I underwent 8 weeks of training, as they pushed us through rather quick in those days. The normal 12-week course was reduced to 8. And then I was later assigned to the Office of Naval Intelligence as a radio communications specialist.
Now, we talked a little bit about, we should talk a little bit about your training, and first of all, why you were selected or you volunteered for this training.
I volunteered.
You volunteered, and you had a little background in it.
I had background in it. I excelled at typing in school, and then I was fortunate. My father was the president of the Tropical Radio Telegraph Company, and I went into Boston, his radio stations, and for 6 months prior to my enlistment in the Navy, I practiced under one of his radio operators who taught me the basis of TWX and radio teletype.
So you were a natural, and the Navy was glad to get you. I'm
Yes,
sure.
that's about the size of it. Yeah.
So you went to school in Washington?
Yes, I went to school in Washington. It was an 8 weeks course, and the most up-to-date teletype radio communications that we had at that time, which was a perforated tape, and which would transmit at 60 words per minute back to our base station in Washington, D.C., of all information that we received from our radio operators in regard to the interception of German submarine or Japanese submarine messages.
So we talked a moment ago about the unit. You were assigned to a unit that was...
I was assigned to Op 20G.
Op 20G was more like a naval district in that it was a giant area of responsibility, a unit that covered a great area.
Yes, right. And due to the sensitive nature of the material from top secret right down, we were not really told much about the other operations in this complete scenario. In the respects to the cryptograph room, people working in cryptograph, which actually ultimately broke into the English language exactly what the enemy was saying. And this was the function of a station. Now, I was assigned to Chatham Naval Radio Station on late September of '43. And after arriving, we had 3 watches covering the day shift, evening shift, and midnight shift. Around-the-clock coverage of the of the German U-boat transmissions.
Now, the area of responsibility ranged from as far north in the United States as Maine.
It went all the way from Newfoundland, and right down to Recife, Brazil.
So different units covered different areas.
That's correct.
But Ops 21, your unit, covered exactly what area?
Well, it depended on the radio freak man. In other words, our frequency operator would set up all the frequencies. Now, we would have a total of usually about 20 operators, 20 radio operators listening on different frequencies. So you had 20 different frequencies at least being covered. They could, as far as the area that they were operating in, I really couldn't speculate on that. I don't know. I would have just assumed that they would be assigned a sector to cover, but I'm not really sure on that.
Basically, if you could receive a signal, you received a signal.
That's correct.
So even if it was in Brazil, if you somehow could pick it up.
That's correct.
Yeah, I see.
And whatever was received by the radio operator was handed to us, and we, through our teletype machines, would forward it to Naval Intelligence in Washington, D.C. for further process in the field of cryptograph.
I've dropped my script somewhere. I'm sitting on it. Okay. Okay. So the one group is responsible for deciding what the Germans were going to be transmitting. You set up the transmission, the reception apparatus, and then it was your job to copy the.
That's right. To retransmit. Yeah.
And you passed it on to another man who could turn it into the English language.
That's correct. At the receiving end in Washington, this is where that was done.
Now, were these messages, assuming they started one way and maybe stayed that way and weren't changed, how were these messages coded? They weren't just simply in the German language.
German code is a four-letter, during World War II, was a four-letter code. And the designators of how important the message was, to give you an example, if the preceding two letters, WW, would be a weather bulletin. If it was a BB or a B-bar, it was Enigma. This was the code machine that the German operators aboard the submarines had to set up their code, who were not aware that we, through the capture of a German submarine by the British in the early part of the war, were not aware that we knew exactly what they were saying. And through this process, we never let on, right to the end of the war. It was the most closely guarded secret in World War II that we had the German code and could understand everything they were transmitting.
Now, it was a little out of your area of responsibility, but since the British actually had the single Enigma machine, do you suppose the Americans were able to copy it, or we basically knew how it ran and we were able to duplicate its mechanism?
We had our own code machine. I wouldn't be a bit surprised that through research of some sort was instrumental in the design of our own code machine, which, by the way, they never knew.
They never broke it.
We never broke our code, because anything we transmitted back would be in code. And then we had what they call a scrambler at the other end, which would unscramble the transmission. The size of the group at Chatham, we had 2 officers, about 7, 8 chief petty officers, approximately 100 men, because we ran 3 watches, as I mentioned before, about 24-hour coverage of these frequencies. The traffic was extremely heavy when I was there, and it was all 3 teletype men could do to keep up with it. And we were able to transmit at 60 words per minute because of these advanced machines.
Oh boy.
And we also had at the station 10 general service personnel. These would be cooks, bakers, motormechs, to run our auxiliary power, things like of that nature. They were not in our operation. We were strictly, our station had civilian guards, and as we get along in this tape here, which were after this incident, security was reinforced at the station.
So you were at first billeted right there on the station in the barracks?
I was billeted at the radio station itself. The majority of the enlisted men were billeted in the Hawthorne Inn in Chatham, which was a private inn taken over by the Navy during the war. It no longer is there. There is now a Hawthorne Motel. It burnt down right directly after the war. The main station had two main houses of brick, and the officer and chief of warrant were berthed in those homes. I was berthed in the main brick building, which was a two-story in front of the radio shack, which was in back. Our transportation to and from the watches and to the mess deck, which was at the Hawthorne Inn, was by a Navy bus. We were approximately 3 miles from the billeted quarters of the majority of the men stationed there.
Well, then so we've established pretty much how the station was oriented. You wanted to ask if there were any Army intelligence or G2, OSS, any other personnel that you might have seen.
There was a Coast Guard radio station and a Coast Guard light station in Chatham, which were up the road about 4 or 5 miles. There was an Army radar station directly in back of us, approximately 2.5 miles to 3 miles away from us on a high hill overlooking the ocean. The waves that came to relieve us in the end finally took over the Rose Acres resort for the billeted quarters, and they had one wave officer in charge of that group. This was to relieve us for overseas duty and take up the operation that we were presently performing. As far as Secret Service and OSS, I can tell you this one thing. I know we were constantly being watched by the FBI. That much I do know. We were told to keep very, very quiet on our operation, not to mention it to anybody. We had a lot of inquisitive people in Chatham wondering what we were doing there, a Navy station.
Loose sink ships.
Sink ships, that's correct. And because of that, we were constantly had the feeling that we were being monitored in all phases. And of course, in those days, you didn't ask any questions. You just did your duty, and that was it. You kept away from any talk with civilians, especially civilians, on our duties.
Now, one thing that I wanted to ask is, as you started working there and you were copying transmissions, what kind of message traffic or radio transmissions did you copy from our own forces that might be sent out against the Germans? Or
that I really don't know. We didn't have any function in that. Our only function, again, like I say, was the copying and the retransmission of these signals back to Washington Naval Intelligence.
Okay, so you were there in fall of '43. Do you remember anything? Does anything come to your mind that relating to combat actions in the immediate area through the end of '43?
Not really. I was aware that a German submarine was sunk at the entrance of Buzzards Bay. I've been told by several people that it was possibly a mine layer. It was on the eastern entrance of the canal.
What time frame would this have been?
Around 42, I would say 42 or 43 it was sunk, as I understand it now. I don't know how accurate my information is. A lot of this is scuttlebutt. But that's what I had heard. And
so there was a feeling that you were really doing something important.
Oh, yes.
You knew that these subs were all around. And
we did a very good job there. In the end of the war, we were the personnel that served there and also overseas in the Pacific, where I also served, were awarded the Navy Unit Commendation for our work. So I'm sure our work was very, very essential and very helpful in the culmination of the naval war.
There was a good camaraderie and
oh yes, very much so. Very much so.
Tight unit. Okay, so as if there weren't any outstanding incidents in through '43 that you're reminded of, the first one we're particularly interested from an airship standpoint would have been in July of '44 off Bar Harbor, Maine. A fisherman had spotted a U-boat periscope and reported it, and a blimp was detached the K-14 was dispatched to investigate. Now, do you have any recollection of any message transmission around the early part of July of 44 that would have indicated there was a U-boat in the area of Bar Harbor, Maine?
Again, a lot of this is scuttlebutt. I had heard that they had sunk a German submarine off Bar Harbor.
And indeed it was sunk 2 days, about 48 hours after the K-14.
As far as where I heard it, I'm not sure on that one. I mean, this is 52 years ago.
Yeah.
And
but you don't remember any particular message traffic that would indicate that?
Not on that one, no, I don't, no.
Okay.
Pertaining to this one we're going to come to, yes, I'm well aware of what I'm pretty sure that went on there. But as far as the one off Maine, I'm not really sure, but I have a good suspicion that reports I heard and the bump involved leaves a lot to be desired as far as an explanation from our government.
The Court of Inquiry held the pilot responsible as pilot error as flying too low and impacting the water, but there were a lot of unanswered questions like why all the bombs were launched and why the machine gun had been fired so much.
That's right.
And why there were so many holes in the envelope.
That's right.
And we're trying to track that down now, but we do know that the U-233 was sunk a few miles away about 48 hours later by surface units.
That's correct.
And supposedly one of the survivors, of which there were 30, bragged about having shot down the Zeppelin.
Right.
And you know there's no German word for balloon.
That is correct, yeah.
So they would have either said Zeppelin or perhaps Parseval, as we know from their advertising glimpse back.
Right.
So any other thing that comes to mind before we get to our point where we are in the latter part of it? We're now in the late summer, early fall of 44. Nothing eventful happened that comes to your mind, but that takes us up to this point. At best, as you can recall, he asks here, what year and date did you and your team first encounter the German U-boat WT transmission off Cape Cod?
Okay, the reason I remember this, why this thing is fairly clear, I had gone on watch, on the second watch, and this was in August, and the reason I remember the month was that Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands and her two daughters, when it fled Holland after the Nazi invasion, were summering with Secret Service protection in Chatham Bar's quarters across from the Chatham Bar's Inn, which was just down from the Hawthorne Inn. I've seen the Queen many times going by in the bus, and we've waved and she waved back, and other than that we never had any connection with her. But she would stay there until the closing of the inn, which was usually just after Labor Day. And so knowing that she was there at that time, I know that this was the month of August. At the time of this incident, we sat back to back to the radio operators with a wall that separated us, but with a cut through. In other words, so the chief could hand the messages and put them into the receiving box, where our watch chief would pass them to us, to each individual that's on the machines, and this is how we kept feeding the material to Washington. Now, at the time of this incident, we could hear all the talk and conversations in the radio room. It was designed that way. There was no door leading into our room from the radio room, and of course this cut through, this big large cut through. Well, at the time of this incident, I heard this one radio operator start laughing, and then she said, "What's going on?" And he said, "Well," he said, "you won't believe this, but he said, I got an S-spy signal here that's so strong, it's unbelievable. But the thing is that up the street from us, approximately 3.5 miles, is a Coast Guard radio station. Now, somehow, this German transmission, this submarine, had got onto the Coast Guard frequency. Now, whether it was intentional or non-intentional, we don't know. But one thing we do know was that the Coast Guard radio operator broke in on the German's transmission. Now, the German submariner never heard him and wouldn't have any reason to be hearing him. And berated him, forbidding him the use of radio all transmission in a war-restricted area, and to cease all transmissions immediately.
Do you suppose this operator knew it was a German submarine?
No, he did not.
So
he had no idea.
Somebody to get off the air.
That's right. He's telling him to get off the air. Now, it's this message that's the one that's in question.
Now, the man who heard this thought this was a big joke. It was very funny.
It was really funny. I mean, they all started laughing. I could hear them laughing, and he's telling them to get off there, that he's in violation of the Communication Wartime Security Act.
And the men who were laughing knew it was a German submarine.
Of course, because they were covering it. So as this message progressed, it came in 3 parts. I do remember that. The total time of transmission probably was around 12 minutes. Originally, once when I was asked by one of the editors to the Boston Herald, I think it was, and had called me in relation to this, he had put down a 20-25 minute period. The 20-25 minute was not the actual transmission. It was the time it took with the breaks. There was 2 breaks in it. Now, I got the first section of that message off. Then the transmission ceased for a minute or so. And then, in continuation of the same message, it continued on. And then again, another pause and break, involving probably 5 minutes even. But again, the same sub, transmitting, till finally the message had been completed. Now, this particular message was a B-bar enigma, high priority. To whom it was going to, I do not remember after 52 years. I remember how we used to type them. I know the call signals of the German receipt back in Germany, which I believe were ADA, and I can't tell you for sure who it was directed at. The reason for this, being accurate on this is because there's a possibility, as I've been told, that the White House had a special receiver, Enigma-type receiver advanced. And there's a possibility that this submarine was possibly trying to defect. And the U.S. government knew about it. And, of course, I heard no more about it that day, but however, the next day, when I went on watch, I heard one chief, we were relieving the watch, say to the oncoming chief, "We got one of the bastards." And the only one that could have possibly heard it were the groups right close to me, and also the few radio men that were on the other side of the wall. There was a dress down in the office the day after.
Now, before we get to that, you didn't have any idea then how the German had been intercepted?
No, I did not. I just assumed that the DF, we know DFs are working the whole coast. And whether it's the Huff-Tuff or the higher frequency direction finders, the nailed him, I don't know.
So these were advanced direction finding equipment was in place, and they could pretty much tell where a transmission was coming from.
That's correct.
And fairly quickly.
Very quickly. With Huff-Tuff, they could tell instantly. Longitude and latitude, no problem.
So it's conceivable that the transmissions, once they were isolated and located to a certain point, as a combat unit was assigned to attack that transmission
That's
location.
Correct. We had TVS squadrons in Hyannis for that very purpose, at Weymouth, and of course we had the blimps. Now I've seen the blimp many, many times, both daytime and even coming on to dusk, making its rounds, whatever its sector of coverage was.
And it turns out the blimp pilots had said that they used one of your radio towers as a navigation
That's
technique.
correct. This Joe fellow that has claimed the sinking of this submarine, Joe told me that he's used our antenna pole many, many times as a navigational check on his route from Weymouth.
So the blimps are around. You knew they were as well as the TVS.
Yep.
Okay, so after the chief, kind of like feeling like we'd had success and said we finally got one of the bastards. what was the feeling around that time? People were busy, of course.
Very busy, and I question just how many people actually knew about that remark that the chief made. I heard it. The other two men in the room that may have heard it, I don't know. There was never too much talk about it, with the exception that what made everything sort of spooky was that the next day, the office in that radio shack, the skipper was in there and he was chewing this chief out. And it was pretty much keep your mouth shut. The hell are you doing here? You know, what are you saying here? This is off limits. I don't want to hear this talk. And that was about the size of it.
Now, had you put together 2 and 2 there that the...
Not really. I did. It really didn't sink in. I mean, years later it did, but...
as far as the guy who was first laughing and saying, oh, there's a German
That's right.
out there, and they're
get
trying to tell him to get off the air.
Right.
And then next day we knew that we detected and destroyed
right.
that German.
That's right.
And then the third day he was received a dressing down for loose lips.
Right.
We never really put all that together at that time.
No. I'm going to tell you something. One day, myself and 2 other men that were communication specialists, we had a break. In other words, we used to work 3 days, day watches, 3 evening watches, and 3 midnight watches. And then we were given 72 hours off. On one of these occasions, 2 of my friends, we had a little small skiff. We rowed out from the cove that we were adjacent to, out to Chatham bars for the picnic lunch and all that. We went swimming over there off the bar, and there was a wreck over there. In fact, I got pictures inside, I'll show you, taken on the beach there. And it did come up. We were looking out at the Atlantic, and I remember one of the men said to me, did you hear that incident there in the old man's office there about we got one of them? I said, yeah, I heard it, but I said, I don't know anything about it. Nobody said anything to me about it. But it was definitely, I think, a cover-up.
So the signal was so strong, the boat had to be very close.
The boat was extremely close. This guy, this radio operator was, I remember him well. He was a nice fellow, he was first class, and he said it was like being on top of him. He said that signal was so strong. And the thing that I've always wondered about, as the years have gone by, is what was he doing on the Coast Guard frequency? Was he trying to get around us, knowing that probably we were there? Or was it just a fading off his regular channel that he was assigned to operate on, his frequency?
Perhaps a bizarre atmospheric condition
right.
where the frequency was so strong at that distance that it also
right.
bled over onto the...
Was he trying to get under the Loran? There was something going on there that I think that they knew what they were doing. In other words, he wasn't by airing off his frequency. I think it was trying to get by our interception.
Now, do we have any idea what he actually said in this transmission?
No, there's no way of knowing that because, again, like I say, this was all 4-letter code. And the only people that could tell you that would be the cryptograph people that worked on the message.
They actually had the enigma.
Right, and as I told you earlier, that we were not informed, we weren't allowed in those rooms when we took our training. The less you knew, the less you could talk about if anything befell you and you fell into enemy hands. So we were kept in the dark about the other end of the operation. We knew what cryptograph was. We understand what it is.
Now, he wants to be specific about whether we had any knowledge of whether the sub was passing or was...
Well, it was definitely on the surface. There's no question about that. I mean, it was surface.
They couldn't transmit radio underwater.
No, not to any...
not at depth.
Any depth. And, of course, in the area that she sunk in, which I've been told is around 40 feet, and even going back over the years with the shifting of the shoals there, top depth would probably be about 60 feet, which makes me wonder what he was doing in that close.
Crazy, because
now there's the Monomoy Island there. Monomoy Island is a place you could land saboteurs. Now they had landed saboteurs on Long Island during the war. Those saboteurs were all caught because of the vigilance of the Coast Guard patrol with a dog and their inability to execute him after he stumbled upon them when they were landing from the rubber life rafts.
a U-boat put them ashore.
That's correct. And they were saboteurs, and they got loose, and there was they were quickly rounded up, and one of them turned state's evidence, or what do you call it, plea bargained for his life, because he helped and locate the other ones that were spread all over different cities with all kinds of incendiaries and papers, which this actually happened, was in Time magazine back then, and the others were executed, and this one man was allowed to return at the end of the war. He was the only one out of that whole group.
Now, there were several saboteurs up and down the coast in different locations then.
Yes.
Probably launched by U-boats at different points.
That's correct.
Well, getting back to our mystery transmission, he asked, do you recall any feelings of frustrations by you or your crew as the lack of response from forces or commands regarding the tardiness in intercepting?
Not really. We were so busy there that we really didn't have time for that. I mean, when I say we were busy, I mean we were really busy. You don't realize if you only knew how many U-boat messages were going out, it would stagger the imagination. You just would not believe that kind of traffic could exist.
All up and down the coast and
correct.
In any number of places. Now, yes, about how long was it the time you picked up the first U-boat transmissions when you first recovered that, when the first vessel had been destroyed, and how was this information received? The chief had made that comment.
Yep.
What was the feeling among your crew at the time they heard of the U-boat sinking? Do you remember anybody else saying, like the beach incident when you went out?
Not really that I knew of. Again, I was, like I said, I was quartered at the radio station, so I didn't get in contact with a lot of the other fellows up there at the Hawthorne Inn, as you would if you had more leisure time with them, with the exception of the incident I mentioned on the beach.
He says, were there any unusual observations the following day when you reported for the next duty assignments?
We did have tighter security. Security was beefed up.
More civilian guards or military?
There was an additional guard at least put on it, and they had in front of the station there was like a half-moon turn. The bus would drive in, pass the guard, and come out the other side. In other words, just like a half moon. And then, as I recall, a second guard post was put down by the other end of the moon.
Okay, he asked if there was any talk. We've covered that. Now, being busy and lots of other message traffic coming through, that was about the last you'd heard of it, and there wasn't any further discussion of it?
No, none whatsoever.
Okay. So then we move on to the point where they were beginning to replace the men with waves,
right,
to take over these duty stations so you could be deployed overseas.
That's correct.
So what about the time? When were you transferred out of Chatham?
I was transferred January of '45, and in that time I was given a 7-day leave, and my orders read to report to Oakland, California, for further transfer to Guam and the Marianas. Went across country on a train and arrived at the Naval Barracks at Oakland, and took my shots and so forth overseas, and abandoning ship, jumping in off a 50-foot platform, all this. And my orders were handed to me, and I was told to proceed to the USS Chandler, which was a 4-stack destroyer, World War I. I boarded that ship, and after it got underway, my orders were opened, and through a Navy snafu, I was on the wrong ship. Instead of going to Hawaii, which was my first leg of my journey to Guam, it was going to Long Beach. So we went to Long Beach and finally anchored there, and I was finally put ashore at the Roosevelt Barracks there, and I finally boarded the USS Oklahoosa, which was a Navy oiler carrying high-octane gasoline for my final journey to Pearl. While I was aboard the Chandler, I heard scuttlebutt again. We get a lot of scuttlebutt in the Navy. The jet sub was sunk at the entrance to Long Beach.
Fairly close in.
Very close.
Do we have any idea exactly when?
Well, again, I don't. Again, this is all what I can recall of the conversation of several crew members now, when they said we sunk it, whether they meant the United States or whether they meant their vessel, I am not aware. But I do recall, because working in the interception of submarine messages, it was of interest to me. It's just something that stuck in my mind, but I do recall. The only other time I've ever heard anything about that was while I was doing my scuba diving back in 1956. There was a publication called Divers Down, and in it listed this incident of a sunken Japanese submarine at the entrance to Long Beach, and a federal law going out prohibiting scuba divers for diving on it because it was very unstable. The ammunition, torpedoes, whatever, aboard it, and they were warning divers it was out of bounds to dive on it. Now, at the time, this Earl Leggett and Warren Leggett is how I passed the information on that finally got to Ed Michaud. When I talked to them back in '56, I had mentioned that a German sub was sunk off Cape Cod and close. And when Earl Leggett and Warren asked me about its location, I said, I can't tell you, but I can tell you one thing, according to our radio operator, it was real close. So, years went by, nothing more was ever thought of it, and I think Ed called me around 1992, I guess it was, or 93, and out of the clear blue sky asked me that he'd talked to Earl and Warren, and they had located this German U-boat laying on the bottom in 40 feet of water. And that's how I got involved.
Now, since then you've talked to Joe Fallon.
Yep.
He was the command pilot of K-25. Of
Yep.
course, K-25, like other K ships, was a Zeppelin-style command. There was a command pilot, there was a pilot, a rudder man, a
Yep.
helmsman,
Yep.
and various men assigned to radio, weapons, what have you. And they would have carrying 4 depth bombs. And we feel pretty sure now that they were dispatched. In other words, they were already in the air, probably on a routine patrol.
Yes.
And when this message came in, one way or another, they were assigned.
They were directed right to it, right?
So, did he tell you anything else in the phone?
Well, he told me that when they came in on them, they had opened up with anti-aircraft gun at them. And they made the bad mistake of making a crash dive. And he remember seeing the men scrambling to get down the conning tower, and she went down, and as we mentioned before, the depth of the water was extremely shallow, which means it's the best. He could just barely cover his conning tower, even at 60 feet. And that he had come over him and dropped one of his depth charges and hit it directly in the back of the conning tower. And that he saw debris come up and close them. And that's what he told me on my telephone conversation with him. And returned to base. And
surely
he
there must
said,
have been great rejoicing. We finally got one.
No, that's unfortunately when his testimony to me was over the phone. He said when he got back to his base, his commanding officer came out and chewed him out and said, now you've stirred up a bee's nest. You better keep your mouth shut and forget all about this incident, when he went to report it. The next day, he went back to his blimp to retrieve his photographic equipment that showed the action, and the tapes had been taken from the camera and removed when he feels by Naval Intelligence. And he was transferred to the canal zone, just like that.
We understand that the whole crew was broken up and sent to different places.
I wouldn't doubt that. I can't speak of the crew, but I do know in his conversation with me, he told me he was transferred to the... And that...
he wound up in Brazil eventually.
Right, in Brazil, and he was apparently stumbled onto something that he wasn't supposed to stumble onto. That's what I'm getting the point of. In other words, the left hand didn't tell the right hand what was going on.
He was doing exactly what he was supposed to do.
Right. If this indeed was a defecting submarine, regardless of what connection it had with the White House as far as its ability to transmit directly to the President or the Secretary of State, via this special machine that was evidently smuggled out of Germany to the White House, We don't know. But I can tell you this one thing. He was a scapegoat. I feel sorry for Joe. I figured Joe, like his son told me, my dad has been telling me how he sunk a submarine in the war, and even his own crew of comrades all denying the report, saying he's loco or something like that. And well, I think that's mean. And I'll tell you something else. I think there was a real stinking cover-up here by the U.S. Navy.
There must have been some terrible threat made against the men.
I'm sure. In fact, he told me he felt that he had to be very careful when he got down to the canal zone, because there was even possibility that somebody was trying to take him out.
Oh, my Lord. Now, he did ask here about the Dutch royal family, if there was any connection that you were aware of with the Dutch royal family being there at Cape Cod.
Well, originally when I mentioned this to Ed Michaud, this Chatham, where I was, is almost like the background of a good movie, of intrigue, foreign agents, if you would. Here was the Royal Dutch family, and of course, with Secret Service protection. And here, we didn't know who was in town and who wasn't in town. Everybody had to keep their mouth shut. It had a real background of a great spy novel. We had no contact with them other than we would wave to them when we went by. And I've seen the Queen many times wave back at us. And she had her two daughters, Beatrice and Queen Juliana. And their group that was with them.
Also on the outskirts of this whole story, he says, have you heard any details about the temporary German capture of the Coast Guard lighthouse at Round Hill Point?
Again, I heard scuttlebutt on it, but I can't pinpoint it. I really don't know anything about that. I have heard it, but with 52 years, you're lucky to remember. The only reason I remember this one is because of the incident with the Coast Guard operator. And that is something you just don't forget. I mean, that kind of thing sticks in your mind.
Now, we know that blimps were redeployed in the Northeast Corridor late in the war because of the fear of various midget submarines. Now, but you were already in the Pacific by then.
Yes, I went at the time that I told her when I rode the Chandler down to Long Beach. It was a very nervous crew. Obviously, Japanese submarines were still a threat. And in fact, when I ended up on the Oklahoma to go to Pearl, carrying high-octane gasoline, I'm going to tell you, I'm glad to see the 5 days go by real quick and get off at Pearl. When I got off at Pearl, they had to do something with me until they could facilitate my transportation there. So I was assigned to the Navy radio station at Waiawa at Pearl, just up in Pearl.
Well,
up in Schofield Barracks there.
Well, I think of it, while you were there at Long Beach, you probably saw blimps operating out of the
Yes, I did.
Station. Did anybody ever question why we didn't have blimps out in Hawaii?
Again, it's one of those things you just don't think of, you know.
We've heard that there was an animosity there. Rosendahl was not liked by the guy who was in charge of the Pacific, and
that
he
could
refused
well
to
be.
have the blimps.
That could well be. But I know that on my final leg of my journey, they told me to live out of my sea bag when I was assigned to that Iowa station. And one night about 2 o'clock in the morning, they woke me up and put me in a Jeep and took me down to Hickam Field. I got on a C-47, loaded with freight. And the first stop we made was this Johnston Island for refueling. And then on to Eniwetok and Kwajalein, and then finally Guam. When I got to Guam, I worked on Jap code, and of course, which was 5-letter. And our DF station was right on the base where our radio station was. And the war had ended then, finally, and everybody was going home. But I was USN. I joined the regular Navy. I wasn't going anywhere. So I watched all my comrades going back on points and so forth, and then a young friend of mine that I went through school with joined the Navy, and he got assigned to the battleship Wisconsin.
Before we get to that point, we know that the Germans were operating in the Indian Ocean, And late in the war, they were trying to make some deals with the Japanese, and a German submarine surrendered to U.S. forces. It was trying to reach Tokyo with radioactive materials and a disassembled Me-262 jet fighter.
That's right.
When you were copying code, do you remember hearing anything about
Oh, yes, I am. They were called the Monsoon Fleet. The Monsoon Fleet were the larger German type boats, and there was quite a few of them. And that operated between Japan and Germany, sometimes bringing material. And we had, even out in Guam, we picked up those signals even before I got there. I know there's record of German U-boat receptions on the Guam station before I was actually stationed on Guam.
But in spite of your experience with copying the German code, they didn't ask you to do any particular German stuff. You were still assigned to Japanese training.
No, I went strictly on Japanese. As I say, at the very end, I shipped over for what they call a 2-year hitch. Everybody's going out of the Navy so fast, there were ships sitting there with no crews to sail them back. And I asked for the battleship Wisconsin because my buddy wrote, he says, you ought to get aboard this. He was a radio striker. And he says, we're going on a midshipman cruise to Europe. And this was in 1946. So when I went and made my request for re-enlistment and transfer to that ship, I was told that I didn't stand much of a chance, but they would submit it. And they did, and it was approved. So the minute it was known in the intelligence community that I was going to leave, I was not allowed in the Radio Shack anymore in Guam, which was then starting to copy Russian code.
Oh.
And I was given a detail of 5 Jap prisoners every day to take out and work around the direction finder poles, keeping the growth cut down and so forth.
When you're in transit, they give you some of the lousiest jobs.
So
you picked up the Wisconsin.
Yeah, I got on to Wisconsin. We made the first. We were the first. We went with our sister ship to New Jersey, picked up the midshipman in Annapolis, and we sailed over up to Halifax, Nova Scotia, and then over to Rosyth, Scotland. We spent the 4th of July in Oslo, Norway, and then we came down to Portsmouth, England. We had liberty in all those ports, and then we crossed the Atlantic, went through the canal and down into Chile, and back up to Peru, back through the canal to Venezuela, and over to Gitmo and back to Norfolk. That was the end of our cruise. It was a long cruise.
What a terrific time.
Yep, that was the good part of the Navy.
Well, help me out here now. If there's anything else that comes to mind that was related to any of this, how we're trying to, from my standpoint anyway, we're trying to establish that the airships were a vital part of the total anti-submarine warfare picture. And anything that comes to mind that, from your experiences, where they played a part? Have we left out anything?
I don't think so. The only thing is I agree with Joe Fallon, and I agree with Ed. I think there's been a very, very serious cover-up of an incident that happened off Cape Cod. I personally believe that everything that I've been informed on in regards to this by Ed is really starting to fit together. And I feel sorry for Joe Fallon because I know his son has been instrumental in trying to get the recognition that his father deserves.
We think it's safe to assume then that the K-14's loss really wasn't related to this. In other words, somebody didn't get confused that this might have been the defecting submarine.
I don't think so, because I'll tell you why. The 233 that you mentioned was not this class boat. This boat here, it was only one built. There was 3 of them designed, and we're not even sure of the U number on it. There's three particular numbers. It's one of the 3, but we just don't know which one it is.
But its radio call letter is what we go by, and that was WT or LT?
No, that would be the wireless transmission.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, Ed has done a lot of research on this. This boat here apparently was built for the Aberfuhrer. Now, the Aberfuhrer was a very select group in Germany. Now, if the story is correct, this was a U-boat that was trying to defect. And aboard it, there's a question of some very high-ranking people, possibly could have been on that boat, from church leaders to politicians and to industrialists, that type of thing. The thought in my mind crosses that possibly trying to end the war between Germany and the United States earlier than and outside the Nazi realm of control. Again, this is all speculation. But because I think Joe Fallon stumbled on this through direction of the signal that we picked up, and also the DF that pinpointed this boat was not supposed to be sunk. And it's
Nobody
also
told the blimp crews.
nobody told the blimp crew.
Go get him, and they did.
Right, and so finally, to bear this out, when Joe returned to the Weymouth Naval Hangar, the blimp hangar, here's his skipper chewing him out. Now you've done it. Now you've stirred up a bee's nest. You pulled a Bubry, you know, and what are you going to say?
Oh, what could you do? Boy, how frustrating. Okay, well, if I think we've covered everything in Ed's list, and we certainly covered everything I could think of. And if you're satisfied that we've covered
I really think we have covered it very, very well. I'll tell you, I was very proud to have served with the men and women in the ONI station. They all deserve credit for the work they did, the long hours that they put in, and the great information that was passed on to the right sources for further action to shorten the life and save lives as many of our merchant seamen as we could from the sinking of these U-boats and causing their final end. I know that in fact, a neighbor of mine right over here, that was over here, he's from Canada, and he was a U-boat survivor. And he was captured in Norway, Trondheim, and Henry and I have become good friends over the years. We've talked about U-boats, so forth, and he showed me his pictures of the sub that he was on. He was one of the lucky ones because there was 40,000 of them went to sea, and 30,000 never came back, and he was one of that 30,000. And there was no picnic for those guys either, you know. But unfortunately, we're not worrying about, that was a time, kill or be killed, whatever, you know. You got to remember that.
Well, okay. Well, we greatly appreciate you talking to us. And
Okay.
we'll wind this up here.
I hope I was any help at all to you.
I'm certainly.
I hope Joe Fallon gets the recognition that he deserves, because I'll tell you, there's a man that deserves it, as far as I'm concerned.
You can push the little button there.
All righty.